Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker, and if you've watched some of my videos in the past, you probably know that I'm not the biggest fan of the Phoenix Suns as an organization, at least in the modern day. I think they're one of the worst run and worst owned franchises in the NBA, certainly across the last 5 years, but despite some of their struggles recently, the interesting thing is they actually have a really proud history. They made the playoffs every single year from 1989 to 2001, and a couple of years later created one of the most memorable teams in league history, the pace and space, run and gun, Mike D'Antoni-led Phoenix Suns. They had Steve Nash and Amar'e Stoudemire and Shawn Marion, and they were so much fun to watch and so far ahead of their time, but for one reason or another, they just never found the kind of postseason success that they hoped for. They never won a championship, they never made the finals, despite so much regular season success and Steve Nash winning 2 MVPs. And the historical narrative to this point has been that the reason that team didn't work out was because of their style of play. They didn't play any defense, they were too soft, they didn't play traditional winning basketball. And while there is some truth to that, the actual story that never really gets told is one of untimely injuries, awful front office moves, and above all, cheap ownership. Which brings us to July of 2004, where a man that we will continue to come back to throughout this video, Robert Sarver, bought the Suns for over $400 million, which coincidentally was the last time that they saw legit success as a franchise. From 2004 to 2008, they won between 54 and 62 games every single year for 4 seasons and twice made the conference finals. And most specifically, that 2004-2005 Phoenix Suns team was amazing. They won 62 games, which was best in the league. They led the league in scoring, and these were their top 5 scorers in no particular order. 22-year-old Amar'e Stoudemire, 26-year-old Shawn Marion, 23-year-old Joe Johnson, 30-year-old Steve Nash, and 24-year-old Quentin Richardson, and they built all of that after coming off of a 29-win season the year before, and that win total improvement from year to year is one of the best in league history. Prior to that 04-05 season, they had signed Nash and Richardson as free agents, given Mike D'Antoni the reins to the team, and that was that. They were young, they were exciting, Nash would go on to win the MVP, and everything was in front of them. So where exactly did things go wrong? Well, we start by going into the 2005 offseason. Going into that summer, the Suns had 4 of their top 5 guys under contract, the guys that I mentioned earlier, with the only one that wasn't being Joe Johnson, who was a restricted free agent, and Sarver had reservations about re-signing him. He had just brought in Nash and Richardson the offseason before and had bought the team, so he'd obviously spent a lot of money on those transactions. But you would think that given the circumstances, he would have been willing to pay up to keep Johnson. Nash had just won the MVP, Marion was an All-NBA selection the previous year, Stoudemire averaged 26 points per game as a 22-year-old and was 9th in MVP voting and 2nd team All-NBA. You know you have a formula that works. A great inside scorer, an outstanding defender, a high-level scorer on the wing, and an all-time great point guard that makes everything work. Now granted, Stoudemire did miss most of the 05-06 season with injury, but once he came back, he was still a really great player for them. Marion was really good for 2 more years in Phoenix as well before he eventually got traded to Miami, which I'll get to later, and Nash played extremely well, even well into his mid-30s. And if anything, given Stoudemire's injury, they needed Johnson more than ever after that 04-05 season. He went on to average over 20 points per game for the next 5 seasons for the Hawks and was an eventual 8-time All-Star. And realistically, the Suns could have kept that core together and they could have brought Johnson back, but they didn't, over what in the end amounted to a less than $1 million difference in salary negotiations and resulted in Johnson requesting that the Suns not bring him back and then him being traded to the Atlanta Hawks in exchange for Boris Diaw and 2 future first-round picks. And at this point you might be saying, but Tucker, they got Boris Diaw. He was really good for the Suns, which is true, and he had his best season of his career in the 05-06 season, though you can certainly explain away a bit of that with the previously mentioned absence of Stoudemire that season and the Suns' fast-paced system. And without question, the impact of Johnson for the Suns would have far outpaced what Diaw did in his 3.5 seasons with the team. But that was that. Sarver refused to pay Johnson, so they ended up trading him for Diaw. They also ended up trading away Richardson that offseason. They signed Raja Bell, and guess what? they still ended up making the conference finals. Now, they did lose to the Mavs in 6 games, but that was without Stoudemire, who was injured, trading away Richardson, and trading away Johnson for Diaw. And so to answer the question that I brought up in the beginning of the video, where did things start to fall apart? Well, this is absolutely it, in my opinion. Had Robert Sarver decided to bring back Joe Johnson and pay up for him in the summer of 2005, they, without a doubt in my mind, would have won at least one championship during this run. But I'm sure some of you are sitting there thinking, why am I putting all the blame on the owner rather than, the guys that are actually paid to make these decisions in the front office? And you're absolutely right to think that, because there are 100% some awful front office moves in this run that contributed to the downfall of this team as well. Let's first look at this team's draft history. And from 2004 to 2006, in huge contrast to the modern day Suns, they actually made some great picks. Luol Deng, Nate Robinson, Marcin Gortat, and Rajon Rondo all had success in the NBA, most notably, obviously, Deng and Rondo, and all 4 of them were originally Suns selections, but none of them actually started their careers in Phoenix. Deng, who was drafted immediately before that magical 04-05 season, was moved for Jackson Vroman and a future first, which became 21st overall, and Nate Robinson, who was moved to New York in the Quentin Richardson deal, while Gortat was traded to Orlando for the ever-valuable future considerations, and Rondo was traded with Brian Grant for a pick that eventually became Rudy Fernandez, who was later traded with James Jones for cash. So if we're following the thread here, had the Suns kept Deng, who became a really good two-way player, they probably don't sign Richardson in the summer of 2004, which means they would have had more money to spend on Johnson in 2005 and probably kept him, assuming Sarver wasn't just being cheap, which is a big assumption, and then what followed wouldn't have happened either, because after 2 more great regular seasons, but ones that resulted in only 1 playoff series victory combined, the team felt the need to change things up, even if just for the sake of change. They decided to trade Shawn Marion to the Miami Heat for a 35-year-old Shaquille O'Neal in 2008, who's about as opposite of a fit for the Suns offense as you can possibly have, and even though he played well, it just never really worked, and for that era of Suns basketball at least, that was basically the end. They missed the playoffs of the 2008-2009 season and had a nice little bounce-back year in the 09-10 season with Steve Nash and Amar'e Stoudemire being healthy and guys like Grant Hill and Jason Richardson doing some things, and that was the last time the Suns made the playoffs. A 9-year and counting drought that has gotten significantly worse over the last 4 seasons, with an average win total of just around 22 wins a season. And so the case that I'm making here is that even though, yes, their style of play probably contributed some to having the playoff failures that they did over that 4-year span, it's also kind of a self-destruction of their own franchise. They did so many things right to build that team in the first place, and then once they created it, basically did everything wrong, and that was what resulted in it completely falling apart. And just to illustrate that point a little bit more, here's basically a trade summary for the Phoenix Suns from 2004 to 2008. They traded away Joe Johnson, Quentin Richardson, Luol Deng, Marcin Gortat, Nate Robinson, Rajon Rondo, and Shawn Marion in exchange for Robin Lopez, 3.5 years of Boris Diaw, Kurt Thomas, and a year of 35-year-old Shaquille O'Neal. And if that doesn't tell you all you need to know, I don't know what to say anymore, because it's very clear to me that it's not, oh, these guys were soft, they didn't play defense, their play style wasn't good enough to win games. They won a ton of regular season games, and they made the conference finals twice, despite the second time around not having Amar'e Stoudemire and having lost both Joe Johnson and Quentin Richardson from a 62-win team, and basically just replacing those guys with Boris Diaw and Kurt Thomas. So you cannot convince me otherwise of the fact that if they'd kept that group together, if they'd kept Joe Johnson, if they'd maybe waited and not traded away Shawn Marion, those Phoenix Suns teams at one point would have won a championship. They just played so well together initially, and I think more often we remember the last 2 seasons of that 4-year run rather than the first one that was actually the most successful, 62 wins and a conference finals appearance. And I'll admit that this happens sometimes. Sometimes we come up with other narratives that maybe make a little bit more sense than we've been told over and over again, but it also is important to look back and understand things that actually caused, in my opinion, the downfall of those Phoenix Suns teams. But that is going to be the end of today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it, and thank you guys so much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, please be sure to check out the boxes on screen, and I will see you all next time.